Picture a Saturday morning in 1957, a vacant lot somewhere in Ohio, or Indiana, or the flat neighborhoods outside of Dallas. The grass is still wet. The air smells like cut clover and something sharper, methanol and castor oil, the particular perfume of a glow engine warming up. A boy is kneeling in the dirt. He is 12 years old. His father is crouched beside him, one hand steadying the fuselage of a small balsa airplane, the other flicking the propeller with his finger. The engine coughs, coughs again, then catches, a hard, insistent scream that fills the whole field and startles the birds off the telephone wire. The boy stands up. He takes the handle in both hands. Two thin steel lines run from his grip out across 60 feet of morning air to the wingtips of the plane. He turns, the plane lifts, the lines go taut, and now the machine is flying, really flying, in a perfect circle around the boy at the center. And he is the pilot, and the sky is his, and this is the whole world. That feeling had a name. It was called control line flying. And for one brief, luminous generation of American boys, it was the closest thing to flight that money could buy. This is the story of what it was, and what happened to it. Before the circle, there was only the sky, and the sky was out of reach. For the first 2 decades of powered model aviation in America, a boy who built an airplane had no control over it whatsoever. He wound a rubber band into the fuselage, set the prop spinning, and let go. The plane went where the wind took it, into a tree, across a fence, into the neighbor's yard, into traffic. Free flight was the only option, and free flight was exactly what the name promised. The model was free, meaning the pilot was helpless. You built it for weeks in the basement, and then you released it into the world and hoped for the best. The glow engine changed the first half of that equation. By the late 1930s, small internal combustion engines running on a mixture of methanol and castor oil were becoming practical and affordable for the first time. A boy could now put real power into a real airplane. What he still couldn't do was steer it. That problem was solved in Portland, Oregon, around 1940 by a man named Jim Walker. Walker ran a small hobby company called American Junior Aircraft. He was the kind of man the hobby world produced in abundance during that era. A tinkerer, an evangelist, someone who believed that model aviation was not a trivial pursuit, but a genuine gateway to understanding how flight worked. He had been experimenting for years with ways to give a pilot actual control over a powered model. What he arrived at was elegant in its simplicity: 2 thin steel wires, running from a handle in the pilot's hand out to a bell crank mechanism in the wing of the airplane. Pull up on the handle. The elevator rises, the plane climbs. Push down, the plane dives. The pilot stands at the center. The airplane flies in a circle around him, constrained by the lines, controlled by the wrist. Walker called it U-Control. He filed his patent in 1942. And in the years immediately after World War II, as American manufacturing retooled and consumer spending surged, and a generation of fathers came home from the Pacific and Europe looking for something to share with their sons, U-Control hit the hobby market like a lit fuse. The timing was not accidental. The post-war glow engine had democratized the hardware. The OK Cub 049, introduced in 1947 by Herkimer Tool in New York, was small enough, cheap enough, and reliable enough that a 12-year-old with a paper route could afford one. A control line kit from Comet or SIG or Midwest cost a few dollars at the hobby shop downtown. The steel wire cost pennies per foot. For the price of a few evenings' work and a Saturday morning in a vacant lot, a kid could stand at the center of a 60-foot circle and fly. The Academy of Model Aeronautics formalized it quickly. Control line stunt and speed events appeared at AMA competitions within years of Walker's patent. By the late 1940s, pilots were performing aerobatic maneuvers, loops, wingovers, figure eights, in front of crowds at organized meets. Speed flyers were pushing their models past 100 miles an hour. A 17-year-old named Thomas Burns set a national control line speed record in 1946, flying a model of his own design at more than 88 miles an hour. He was not an anomaly. He was a signal of what was coming. What was coming was the 1950s. And in the 1950s, control line flying became something that cannot fully be described in competition terms or production numbers or magazine circulation figures. It became a fixture of American boyhood, as common in its time as the bicycle, as seasonal as baseball, as physical and immediate and loud as anything a kid could do on a Saturday morning, with his father standing a few feet away, watching the circle turn. For a long time, that was more than enough. The 1950s did not arrive quietly in the hobby shops of America. By 1950, the shelves that had once held balsa free flight kits and rubber band motors were rearranging themselves around a new center of gravity. Control line equipment occupied more space every season. Kits, engines, wire, fuel, bell cranks, handles, spare props. The Cox Manufacturing Company out of Santa Ana, California, had taken Jim Walker's glow engine revolution and industrialized it. Their thimble drone line put a working 049 engine into a complete, ready-to-fly control line airplane for a price that landed inside the range of a birthday present or a saved-up allowance. SIG Manufacturing in Montezuma, Iowa, was producing balsa kits engineered specifically for control line flight. The Banshee, the Shoestring, the Twister, aircraft that rewarded a careful builder with a machine that could hold a precise aerobatic pattern at the end of 60 feet of wire. Comet Model Airplane in Chicago, one of the oldest kit companies in the country, had pivoted hard toward control line. The Hobby Press, Model Airplane News, Air Trails, American Aircraft Modeler, ran control line content in every issue, month after month, year after year. What all of this built was not just a market, it was a ritual. Saturday morning began before the dew was off the grass. A boy carried his plane in both hands like something fragile and important, which it was. His engine was already primed, a few drops of fuel drawn through the needle valve the night before, the prop flicked just enough to pull the mixture into the cylinder. At the field, and the field was wherever there was enough open ground, a schoolyard, a municipal park, an empty lot behind the hardware store. The startup routine was precise and unhurried. Fuel in the tank, lines staked out and connected, prop flicked until the engine lit. Then the boy walked to the center, took the handle, and nodded. The sound of a toy 49 at full throttle is not a sound that can be adequately described in print. It is somewhere between a scream and a mechanical insect, a hard, penetrating whine that at close range makes conversation impossible, and at a distance carries for blocks. People heard it and knew what it meant. They came to watch. Fathers leaned on car hoods, younger brothers sat in the grass. Men who had never built a model in their lives stopped on the sidewalk and tilted their heads back. What they were watching was a boy, standing still while a machine flew around him. The physical sensation of it was unlike anything else the hobby world offered. The lines did not feel like strings. They felt like an extension of the wrist, taut, alive, transmitting every shift of air pressure and engine torque directly into the palm. A good pilot learned to read the plane through his hands before he could see what was happening with his eyes. He felt the model climbing before it climbed. He felt a gust before it hit. In this way, control line flying was not a spectator hobby wearing the costume of a participatory one. It was fully physical. The boy in the center was not watching a machine perform. He was flying. At the AMA Nationals, the competition circuits codified what backyard flyers already understood intuitively. Precision aerobatics, the stunt event, required pilots to fly an exact, prescribed pattern of maneuvers. Loops, inverted flight, figure eights, wing-over sequences, all performed within defined altitude bands, all judged for smoothness and symmetry. Speed events pushed purpose-built models to velocities that seemed impossible for something so small. Team racing put multiple aircraft in the air simultaneously on adjacent circles, pilots sprinting to their planes mid-flight to refuel and relaunch. Combat events, two planes in the same circle, each trying to cut the other's crepe paper streamer, drew crowds that understood nothing about aerodynamics and everything about competition. This was the golden age, not a golden age in the promotional sense, not the kind of phrase a catalog coins to sell product, a genuine one, a period when the conditions were exactly right, when the technology was accessible and the culture was receptive and the vacant lots were plentiful and the fathers were young and the boys had nowhere better to be on a Saturday morning than standing at the center of a circle with 60 feet of steel wire in their hands, watching their airplane carve the summer sky. None of them knew how briefly it would last. The first sign did not come from a competitor. It came from a transmitter. The transmitter was the size of a shoebox, and it cost more than most men earned in a week. In the early 1950s, radio control for model aircraft was not a consumer product. It was an engineering project. The reed-based systems that had been demonstrated at AMA Nationals since the late 1930s required vacuum tubes, custom wound coils, and a level of electrical knowledge that put them firmly in the hands of engineers and serious experimenters, men who built their own receivers, wound their own servos, and considered a successful flight a minor miracle. The equipment was heavy, unreliable, and expensive. A complete single-channel RC setup could cost the equivalent of several months of a working man's salary. It was not a hobby for boys. It was barely a hobby for adults. But technology does not stay expensive forever. Through the mid-1950s, transistors began replacing vacuum tubes. Components shrank. Prices dropped. The 27 MHz frequency band was opened for model use without licensing requirements, lowering the barrier further. By 1956, a hobbyist named Jack Albrecht had built a workable handheld transmitter. By the early 1960s, proportional RC systems, equipment that gave a pilot smooth, continuous control over multiple surfaces simultaneously, rather than the binary on-off switching of reed systems, were beginning to appear in the high-end hobby market. They were still expensive. They were still difficult to set up and maintain. But they worked. And once something works, the price only goes in one direction. The control line community noticed. How could they not? The hobby press covered RC developments in the same magazines that ran control line content. Hobby shops that sold Cox engines and SIG kits began allocating shelf space to transmitters and receiver kits. The conversations at flying fields shifted. Men who had been flying CL for a decade started asking questions, not because they were ready to switch, but because they were curious. And because curiosity in a hobby community always precedes the market. For most of the 1950s, the coexistence was comfortable. Control line and radio control were understood as different activities with different appeals. CL was physical, immediate, affordable, and competitive. RC was aspirational, the dream of a plane you didn't have to stand underneath, a machine you could send across a full sky rather than constrained to a 60-foot radius. The two communities overlapped at the AMA level, but occupied different corners of the flying field. There was room for both, and most hobbyists assumed there always would be. That assumption was reasonable. It was also wrong. What nobody fully accounted for was the role of the fathers. The men who had introduced their sons to control line flying in the early 1950s were practical men making practical decisions. CL was cheap. CL was learnable in an afternoon. CL produced results the first day. A working airplane in the air, responding to the pilot's hands, doing something real. These were the qualities that had made it the dominant form of powered model aviation in post-war America. But by the early 1960s, those same practical men were reading about radio control in the same magazines their sons left on the kitchen table. And radio control offered something control line could never offer, regardless of how refined its kits became or how precisely its engines ran. It offered freedom from the circle. A radio-controlled airplane could fly anywhere in the sky. It could bank away and come back. It could fly at altitude and disappear into a cloud and return. It did not require the pilot to stand at a fixed point in the center of a defined radius. It did not tether the machine to the man. It was, in the most literal sense, free flight with a pilot, the thing model aviation had been reaching towards since the rubber band era. Finally within reach of a civilian with a checkbook and a Saturday afternoon. Hobby shops reported that RC equipment was moving, not dramatically, not yet, but consistently. A new transmitter here, a kit receiver there, a man who had flown control line for 8 years walking out with something new under his arm, not quite sure what he was starting. The lines were still taut across 1,000 schoolyards and vacant lots. The Oreo 49s were still screaming through Saturday mornings all across the American Midwest and South and West. The circles were still turning, but the horizon had changed, and change, once it finds its direction, does not reverse. The hobby shop was the nervous system of American model aviation. Not the manufacturer, not the magazine, not the AMA club. The shop. The man behind the counter who knew every regular customer by name and by engine preference, who could tell you the difference between a Fox, 35, and an Enya, 35, without looking at the box, who kept a display case of used engines near the register and a hand-lettered sign above the door that said something like, "If it flies, we carry it." These men were not executives. They were not making policy. But they were watching the same numbers every week. what came in, what moved, what sat. And by the mid-1960s, what they were watching told a story that no one in the control line community particularly wanted to hear. RC equipment was moving faster than CL equipment. Not everywhere, not all at once, but consistently enough, in enough shops across enough states, that the pattern was impossible to dismiss as regional or seasonal. Transmitters that had taken months to sell were now gone in weeks. Receiver kits that required a soldering iron and an electronics background were giving way to pre-built units that a man could install in an afternoon. The price of entry into radio control, still high by CL standards, was dropping with each product cycle, and the gap was narrowing faster than anyone had predicted 5 years earlier. The shops responded the way small businesses always respond to a market signal. They gave more shelf space to what was selling. A row of Cox thimble-drone planes that had occupied 6 feet of prime real estate near the front window got compressed to 4 feet, then 3. The SIG control line kits moved toward the back wall. The wire, the bell cranks, the spare props, still stocked, still available, but no longer given the prominent position they had held through the previous decade. In their place, transmitter cases, servo kits, frequency pennants in the colors that identified which radio band a pilot was using, so planes didn't interfere with each other in the air. It was not a hostile act. It was commerce. But commerce has consequences that feel personal when they happen to something you love. The boys who had learned to fly control line in the early and mid-1950s were young men now. In their 20s, some of them with sons of their own approaching the age when a first airplane becomes possible. And the hobby landscape they were navigating was subtly but unmistakably different from the one they had grown up in. The vacant lots were still there, the summer mornings were still there, but the cultural gravity had shifted. When a father walked into a hobby shop in 1967 or 1968 to buy his son a first airplane, the display near the door was no longer a Cox PT-19 control line trainer. It was increasingly likely to be something with an antenna port and a channel selector. Control line did not disappear from the competition circuit. Far from it. The AMA Nationals continued to include stunt, speed, racing, combat, and Navy carrier events throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. The pilots who competed in these events were serious, skilled, and deeply committed. Men who had refined their technique over years and who regarded the precision disciplines of CL aerobatics as a legitimate athletic pursuit, which it was. At the high end of competition flying, control line remained vital, contested, and technically demanding. New designs appeared. Engine technology continued to improve. The top stunt pilots of the late 1960s were flying maneuvers of a complexity and consistency that would have seemed impossible to the schoolyard flyers of a decade earlier. But competition flying and backyard flying are not the same thing. They never were. The schoolyard had always been where the hobby replenished itself, where a 12-year-old with a kit and a Boeing 049 became a 15-year-old with an opinion about needle valve settings, became a 20-year-old who showed up at AMA meets, became a man who taught his own son on a Saturday morning in a vacant lot. That pipeline depended on the schoolyard, and the schoolyard was quietly emptying. Not dramatically, not with any single moment of rupture. The transition from control line to radio control happened the way most cultural shifts happen, gradually, then all at once, with the gradual part lasting so long that most people inside the hobby barely registered it until the acceleration made it undeniable. A club that had counted 30 control line flyers at its Saturday morning sessions in 1962 counted 20 in 1968 and 12 in 1972. The 12 who remained were excellent pilots. But 12 is a different thing from 30. And everyone standing in that field knew it, even if no one said so directly. The engines were still running. The lines were still flying. But around the edges of the circle, the crowd had thinned. The boys who used to stop on their bicycles to watch had somewhere else to be. A few of them had RC planes of their own now, planes they flew from the far end of the field, planes that needed no center point, no fixed radius, no pilot standing still with wire in his hands. The circle was still turning, but the world it was turning inside had grown very much larger. And large worlds have a way of making small ones invisible. There was no announcement, no industry press release, no AMA bulletin declaring that an era had ended. What there was instead was a Tuesday afternoon in the early 1970s, or a Wednesday or a Thursday, the exact day no longer matters, when a hobby shop owner somewhere in the American interior looked at his control line inventory and made a quiet decision. He would not reorder the Sig Banshee kit when it sold through. He would not restock the Brodak wire and the 100-foot spools. He would carry what he had until it was gone, and then he would use that shelf space for something that turned over faster. It was not a philosophical statement, it was arithmetic. But arithmetic applied consistently across hundreds of shops in hundreds of towns over the course of a decade is how a hobby loses its infrastructure. And a hobby without infrastructure does not survive at the level of the schoolyard. It survives only at the level of the devoted, the men who already know what they need and know how to find it. By the mid-1970s, that was increasingly what control line flying had become, a hobby of the devoted. The competition circuit continued. The AMA Nationals still ran CL events, and the pilots who showed up for them were among the most technically accomplished aeromodelers in the country. Precision aerobatics, the stunt event, had evolved into something of genuine athletic and aesthetic sophistication. A top-level stunt pilot in 1975 was flying a pattern of 19 prescribed maneuvers with a consistency and smoothness that required years of accumulated muscle memory. These men practiced the way musicians practice, not to get better at the individual maneuver, but to reach the level where the maneuver disappeared into something that looked effortless. They were artists working in a medium that most of America had stopped watching. At the club level, the Saturday morning sessions continued. Smaller, quieter, but they continued. The men who gathered at the local AMA field with their control line planes were, by now, a specific kind of person. They had come up through the schoolyard in the 1950s. They had stayed with the discipline through the RC transition, not out of stubbornness, but because the circle still gave them something the open sky could not. There was a particular quality of attention that control line demanded. A complete, undivided, physical present tense focus that lasted exactly as long as the engine ran. No transmitter to fidget with, no frequency conflict to manage, just the handle, the wire, and the plane, and the relationship between all three running directly through the pilot's hands. Some of them had tried RC. Some had even flown it for a season. Most had come back. But they were not being replaced. That was the fact that sat at the center of every conversation that wasn't quite being had at those Saturday morning sessions. The men were in their 30s now, some of them in their 40s. The younger faces that should have been appearing at the edge of the circle. The 12-year-olds, the teenagers, the young men in their 20s building their first competitive stunt ship were not there. They were at the RC field on the other side of the park, or they were at home with a video game, or they were simply somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had nothing to do with model aviation of any kind. The pipeline that had always run from the schoolyard through the club field to the Nationals had silted up somewhere in the middle. The downstream end was still flowing. The upstream end had gone dry. The last time most American children encountered control line flying as a natural, ambient part of childhood was somewhere in the early to mid-1970s. After that, it required a deliberate introduction, a father or grandfather who specifically sought it out, who drove to a specialty shop or ordered from a catalog, and sat down at a workbench with a child and taught the startup sequence and the line check and the hand position as a conscious act of transmission, rather than a natural consequence of living in a neighborhood where this was simply what boys did on Saturday mornings. Conscious transmission is not the same as cultural presence. It produces devotion in the individuals it reaches. It does not produce the broad, ambient, self-replenishing community that a hobby needs to remain visible to the culture at large. The culture at large had moved on. Atari arrived in 1970. The RC market continued to grow. Electric motors, foam construction, computerized transmitters, then the drone revolution of the 2010s. Each new wave of technology drew attention and money and young people away from anything that required 60 feet of wire and an open field, and the patience to learn a physical skill that offered no shortcut to competence. The last circles turned without ceremony. A man in a municipal park in Ohio on a September afternoon in 1978, flying a pattern he had been flying for 20 years, his engine running clean and his lines perfectly balanced, the plane carving the sky the way it always had. No crowd. His wife reading in a lawn chair at the edge of the field, his son somewhere else. He flew until the fuel ran out. He wound the lines onto the reel. He walked to his car. The field was quiet the way fields go, quiet after something stops happening in them, Not empty, exactly, but present-less. The grass still bent in the wind. The sky was still the same sky. But the circle was gone. The circle never fully closed. It just moved to places most people stopped looking. Brodak Manufacturing, operating out of Carmichael's, Pennsylvania, still produces control line kits and equipment. Their catalog, printed and mailed to customers who know to ask for it, lists stunt kits, combat planes, wire, handles, bell cranks, and glow fuel in quantities that assume a serious builder, not a casual one. They have been filling orders for decades. Their customer base is loyal, knowledgeable, and aging. New names appear on the mailing list occasionally. Not often enough to change the demographic math, but often enough to keep the catalog honest. The AMA still sanctions control line events, precision aerobatics, speed, combat, racing, Navy carrier, all still contested at the national championships held every summer in Muncie, Indiana. The pilots who compete in these events are, without exception, exceptional. A top-level stunt competitor in 2026 is flying maneuvers of a precision and consistency that the schoolyard pilots of the 1950s would not have believed possible. The discipline has not declined in its upper reaches. It has simply lost the broad base that once fed those upper reaches from below. At the club level, Saturday morning sessions still happen. Fewer clubs, fewer members, fewer fields willing to accommodate the noise of a glow engine in an era of noise ordinances and liability concerns. The men who show up, and they are almost entirely men, almost entirely past 60, carry their planes the same way they always did, carefully in both hands, like something fragile and important. They check their lines with the same ritual attention their fathers taught them. They start their engines with the same sequence of priming and flicking that has not changed in 70 years. When the engine catches and the plane rises and the lines go taut, the look on their faces is not nostalgia. It is concentration. They are still flying. They have never stopped. What is missing is not the skill or the dedication or the machinery. What is missing is the boy at the edge of the circle, watching. In the rest of the world, that boy still exists. Control line flying remains the dominant form of powered aeromodeling in Russia, Brazil, and across much of Eastern Europe and South America. International competition at the FAI level, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, draws elite CL pilots from dozens of countries, flying precision patterns and speed runs that represent the technical ceiling of what the discipline can achieve. The global community is active, organized, and multi-generational in ways that the American community has not been since the 1960s. Only in America did the circle shrink to the point of near invisibility. Only in America did radio control, and then electric foam, and then the drone, and then the screen arrive in such rapid and overlapping succession that each generation of boys had a new and more frictionless option before the old one had time to take root. The circle required patience. It required a field. It required a father or a mentor willing to stand in the grass for an afternoon and teach the hand position, and the line tension, and the feel of the elevator responding to the wrist. It required, in short, exactly the kind of deliberate, unhurried transmission of skill that American consumer culture became progressively less willing to support. The man in the municipal park is still out there, somewhere in Ohio, or Indiana, or the flat neighborhoods outside of Dallas. On a Saturday morning, when the grass is still wet and the air carries the particular sharpness of methanol and castor oil, he is kneeling beside his plane and priming the engine and preparing to stand at the center of his circle for one more hour. He is not preserving a relic. He is flying. The sky above him is the same sky it always was. The circle is 60 feet across, exactly as it has always been. The lines are taut. The engine is running. Nobody is watching. But the plane doesn't need an audience. It just needs the wire and the hand and the sky.